All right, I'd like to welcome everybody here today and thank you all so much for joining us today here at the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics for the fourth in our four-week seminar on our panel leading up to the 2022 midterm elections. This has been our midterm seminar series. I want to give, by the way, before we get started today, I want to give a huge shout out to Eric Upsall, who's on our call here, who's our communications director, who has set up this program, reached out to all our speakers. I want to thank all of our speakers along, but Eric has done just an amazing job putting all of this together, and we are all super, super grateful for him for the work that he's done to allow us here to bring together leading scholars to present new and in-progress research at the intersection of social media, politics, and democracy as we look towards the now rapidly approaching 2022 midterm elections. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm one of the co-directors of the Center for Social Media and Politics and a professor of politics here at NYU. I've been excited about all of it, but I'm incredibly excited about today's conversation because I did write a big review piece a few years ago where I said one of the things we really needed to do as a field was move beyond just doing research on Twitter, which might be looking very prophetic at the particular moment in time. But one of the things we called for was for more research on other platforms. And today we're going to focus on new research on platforms that are not Twitter or Facebook. And we're going to be in particular looking at new research on YouTube's recommendation algorithm, on political communications on TikTok, and on right-wing platforms, Gab, Getter, Parler, and Truth Social. We're going to have 10-minute presentations from three experts in the field. We'll have Parker Bach from the UNC Center for Information Technology and Public Life. We'll also have our own CSMAP's own Megan Brown, our senior research engineer here at the Center for Social Media and Politics, and then David Thiel from the Stanford Internet Observatory. And as I note that all of our speakers today are from Knight Research Networks, let me give a huge shout out as well to the Knight Foundation for all the support that they've provided to all our different research institutes and allowing this kind of work to come together and for us to share that work collaboratively. So without further ado, our first speaker today, with a little more ado, I want to note that again, because we're using the webinar format, the way to ask questions is to use the Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I assume most people are familiar with this by now, but one of the nice things about the Q&A button is that you can ask your questions at any time. I will direct questions to the panelists after they've all done their initial presentations, but please feel free to write down questions as the panelists are speaking, as ideas pop into your head, or at the end when I call for them. So now, without further ado, our first presentation today will be from Parker Bach, who's a PhD student at the Hussman School of Journalism and Media and a graduate student affiliate with the Center of Information Technology and Public Life, both at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research focuses on digital politics, political humor, internet culture, and the American right. He will present ongoing research on political TikTok, examining cross-partisan dynamics and the role of video creator identity in political content on the platform. Parker?
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. As Josh just mentioned, I'm Parker Bach. I'm from UNC Chapel Hill and an affiliate with the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. And today my research deals with political discourse on TikTok, particularly identity and my experience using computational methods to conduct that research. And give me 1 second, sorry, as I adjust the Zoom settings here so I can see my notes. So as a brief overview of where this presentation is headed, I'll first briefly discuss some background on TikTok as a political platform before moving on to some findings from an exploratory digital ethnography I conducted this spring. I'll then talk about my experience conducting computational research on TikTok in general before proceeding to describe how I'm applying these methods to my current project, which is on identity and politics. So as we're likely all aware at this point, TikTok has a huge and burgeoning user base around the world, and it's especially catered to and popular with Gen Z audiences, who increasingly use the app for functions such as search and news consumption in addition to mere entertainment. And this is supported by recent data from Pew, which suggests the rising importance of TikTok in these areas as news consumption increases there, but decreases on other platforms. And I expect it will only go up with the downfall of Twitter that we may be experiencing right now. And TikTok has already proven an effective platform for political communication, from organizing, as in the case of these Gen Z TikTok users who used the platform to sabotage Donald Trump's ill-conceived Juneteenth 2020 rally by organizing mass reservation of the seats in the stadium without showing up, to candidates in this current midterm cycle like John Fetterman, who are using the platform to flex their internet savviness. Next, I'd like to briefly take you through a few of the findings of an exploratory digital ethnography I conducted of TikTok this spring, and that have motivated my ongoing research. So this was a digital ethnography of conservative TikTok, which is a loose network of users connected by their political ideology and interest in conservative political content, which is detected and then responded to with that content by the TikTok recommendation algorithm. So this ethnography required me doing what I call training the algorithm, which is engaging with conservative content through liking, following, and other behaviors to try to receive more such content from the algorithm and receive less of other content, which I think is an interesting methodological question and something I'm happy to answer more questions about in the Q&A. One finding from this study was a phenomenon that I call crossing the algorithm. I theorized this as a specific political form of context collapse in which a creator of political content has their videos picked up in the stitches and duets of the opposing political side, and particularly when this rush of engagement from across the aisle leads to that political user's content being automatically served to audiences that are more politically adversarial rather than the same ideology users that are typically the audience for that creator. As you can probably imagine, this often leads to networked harassment for the users who cross the algorithm. And while this certainly occurs in both ideological directions, we know from some existing research that the left is more likely to stitch to the right on TikTok, but this may be happening elsewhere just via other channels on the right, as actors like Libs of TikTok suggest. Like other platforms, TikTok is also full of remediated misinformation, but there's a couple of specificities of TikTok that I think are worth addressing. One is that this platform, as opposed to others we're more familiar with studying, has much less of an ability to link back to other sources. There's very rarely links to source attributions. And the second is that this platform is very much based on the recommendation algorithm over following for what shows up on a user's timeline, meaning that users are less familiar with the accounts posting what may be in their feed. And so less trusted streaming sites like this one here, a right-wing site that streams on, I think, cozy.tv, has all of the trappings of a newsroom, could show up right next to something like, NBC or ABC. And finally, I found that conservative TikTok was full of what Nancy Leong calls identity entrepreneurs. These are members of non-dominant identity groups who leverage their identity to support dominant groups for personal material gain. And so specifically here, when I'm referring to dominant identity groups, I'm talking about white and straight identities, as opposed to queer creators and creators of color. Basically, I was very surprised by the number of non-dominant identity creators I observed gaining a lot of popularity on conservative TikTok. And I noticed in particular that the vast majority of the content of these creators focused on issues of identity, which is something that we often think about as the domain of the left. These identity-focused videos enabled claims on the right of the supposed intolerant left idea, which suggests that the left is somehow more intolerant of conservative ideology than they claim that the right is of identity characteristics. And these identity entrepreneurs were able to address this topic in ways that dominant group creators on the right are less able to because of their identities. So this finding is the basis of my ongoing project. And before I get to describing that research to you, I'd just like to talk about my experience conducting computational research on TikTok in general. In short, there are a lot of obstacles. So TikTok announced earlier this year that as part of ongoing transparency efforts, they would be allowing access to a research API and a content moderation API for some selected researchers. But there's been little released about this, actually none released about this as far as I'm aware since that initial announcement. So if you're from TikTok and you're listening to this talk, please reach out. I would love to be one of the selected researchers. And while there are some non-official tools for collecting TikTok data on places like GitHub, many of these have stopped being supported as TikTok has changed their platform architecture over time, which is what led Dr. Dean Freelon, my collaborator and also of UNC and CTAP, to create PikTok, which is an open source TikTok scraper written in Python and available on GitHub, which allows for the downloading of videos and metadata, including all comments from TikTok, the ability to retrieve the 30 most recent videos for a user, and the ability to download full TikTok JSON objects. I've contributed to PikTok by allowing for you to put in a particular hashtag that you'd like to search and retrieve as many URLs for videos containing that hashtag as you'd like. This uses TikTok's built-in search feature, so it's going to first prioritize some combination of popularity of the videos and recency. as well as the ability to scrape video sticker text from videos. So any text that users may put on screen in their videos. And while I haven't yet had the chance to do this, it seems very possible to add the abilities to scrape all stitches or duets to a particular user, scrape all uses of a particular sound, and possibly scrape all videos posted by a user instead of just the most recent 30. So if this is something that interests you, definitely stay on the lookout for these updates down the line. And TikTok's been extremely useful, but there's still some drawbacks to computational research on TikTok. The first is rate limiting. I found myself getting blocked by TikTok after about 500 to 2,000 GET requests, usually stalling out data collection for about 24 to 48 hours at a time. I've been able to circumvent this using an IP rotation service, which I'm happy to discuss more with anyone interested. I would say data attrition is also not ideal. Over the course of a month of data collection, I lost over 7% of the posts that I originally collected. And perhaps the challenge most unique to TikTok, as opposed to some other platforms that we're familiar with, is hashtag usage, which is essentially the Wild West on TikTok. These posts include usually a huge number of hashtags, and other than the most popular hashtags, they're very not unified. So to illustrate this, of the over 34,000 videos that are in my sample, I have nearly 33,000 distinct hashtags. So it's truly all over the place. And finally, and here I'm going to virtually knock on wood, this scraper is entirely dependent on the stability of TikTok's architecture. So use it while you can. We'll try to update it as long as we can, but definitely if this is something you're interested in, it's always worth moving fast. So as I mentioned earlier, the current project I'm working on focuses on the intersection of identity and political discourse on TikTok. So as some background, recent survey data suggests that Gen Z Republicans are much more likely than older conservatives to value diversity and recognize things like identity-based inequalities in society. Meanwhile, some other research suggests that white Republicans tend to favor those conservatives of color who make overtly racialized appeals in their political discourse over conservatives of color who ignore race, which supports Leong's notion of identity entrepreneurs that I described earlier. So my research question, spurred by my exploratory qualitative findings, is essentially how these trends converge on TikTok, which is a platform with a disproportionately Gen Z user base and which is increasingly used for political discourse. So to answer this question, I collected about 800 videos from 9 hashtag pages, 3 liberal, 3 conservative, and 3 political, but nonpartisan hashtags. To these, I added the 30 most recent videos for each of the 1,300 distinct users that made those 1,800 videos. And I would love to have more data to share with you now. Unfortunately, this is very much a work in progress, and I'm currently on these next 2 stages, which are manually coding the hashtags as addressing politics or identity so that I can keep only the relevant videos in my sample, and manually coding accounts as right, left, or unclear. I would have loved to be able to do this sort of identifying of ideology via follower networks as we do on other social media networks. But unfortunately, that data just isn't available with the tools we have for TikTok right now. And finally, once I've collected all that data, I hope to use some analyses such as word frequencies and GSDMM topic modeling of comments, video descriptions, sticker text, and hopefully video transcripts to see how different constellations of partisan and identity groups discuss identity on TikTok. And so I don't yet have the data to confirm this, but I do have some hypotheses. First, sort of squaring with our notions of the modern American political platforms, I expect that identity-related topics will be much more prevalent on the left than the right. But that being said, I expect that there will be discussion of identity on the right, and that it will be highly concentrated in the content of non-dominant identity creators serving as identity entrepreneurs, essentially taking on the work of addressing identity in lieu of conservative, straight and white creators. I also expect that these conservatives from non-dominant identity groups will address identity as frequently as their counterparts on the left, and that due to the tokenizing role of identity entrepreneurship, they'll receive the most engagement on their videos, which do center identity versus other topics. So to conclude, I'd just like to voice my support for the use of mixed methods in researching TikTok. In my experience, my qualitative methods were really useful at understanding how various elements of video content, including sounds and visuals, came together to create meaning, as well as sort of cutting through some noise to notice trends in videos across content. But due to the centrality and responsiveness of TikTok's recommendation algorithm, I always sort of doubted that what I was seeing could adequately represent certainly the platform as a whole, but even segments of the platform like conservative TikTok. Computational methods can deliver that scale and better representativeness, but they have more trouble analyzing the content of videos themselves, which is, of course, the primary content of TikTok. And where computational methods fall short due to the tools we have available, such as I mentioned about follower networks, I've also turned to more traditional quantitative methods like coding to fill in the gaps. So at least until TikTok opens up their APIs like they've promised to do, I believe that this mixed methods approach is the best way to get the full picture. So thank you for your time. I look forward to sharing this research with all of you as it progresses, and don't forget to vote.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Parker. Our next speaker will be Megan Brown, who is a senior research engineer and research scientist at NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. As a research engineer, Brown collects and maintains large-scale collections of social media and digital trace data for the purposes of social science research. In her research endeavors, she studies cross-platform media manipulation, political bias in algorithmic systems, and the effects of platform governance and moderation policies on the spread of political content. She's going to present a working paper called Echo Chambers, Rabbit Holes, and Algorithmic Bias, How YouTube Recommends Content to Real Users. Eric, I can't post to the whole list, but maybe you could put the link to the SSRN post of the paper up in the chat for everyone who's attending right now. I will note two other things. Megan is absolutely the glue that holds CSMAP, all of our research endeavors together. So it's amazing to have her presenting here today. And she's applying to graduate school. So if you see an application from her coming in this fall, please open it and give it the utmost and most serious consideration, because she's absolutely amazing. All right. How's that for introduction? Megan, take it away.
Thank you, Josh. Let me share my screen. Does that all look good? Perfect. So hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'll be presenting co-authored research with Angela Lai, Jim Bisbee, Rich Bonneau, Jonathan Nagler, and Josh Tucker on how YouTube is recommending content to real users. So first, why are we sort of interested in looking at YouTube? This really great Pew study, which we use in a lot of this work, found that YouTube is actually the most commonly used social media platform in the United States. And it's not only used for cat videos or watching, I guess these days, Mr. Beast videos. People are also using YouTube to get a lot of their news. About a quarter of US adults are using YouTube to learn more about the world and what's going on. YouTube's also very different from sort of typical mainstream media, or the way that people have consumed media in the past, where they go and search for particular news sources that they often are following, like the New York Times or Fox News, because a lot of what YouTube is, what people consume on YouTube is via its recommendation system. So you're sort of in this different world where now, instead of going to search for specific sets of information, you're getting information that's algorithmically generated based on your prior research. And it's also personalized to you. So what happens when you're on YouTube is that your recommendation algorithm learns about you, what you like, and starts recommending you more content like the previous content you've seen. So what has that led to? There's a lot of popular concern that YouTube is radicalizing a lot of people, that it's sending people into far-right echo chambers or towards far-right extremist content, that it's giving people more conspiracy-related content, or that overall it's radicalizing people, sending them off to the extreme version of whatever it is that they were watching before. The quantitative research on this is fairly mixed. Results from these studies are largely inconclusive. Some of the studies show a large increase in the consumption of right-wing content on YouTube, and particularly with far-right content on YouTube, both consumption of that content and engaging with that content. Other studies have also found that YouTube, on average, isn't recommending particularly extreme content. They're recommending generally mainstream news related to political news videos, is what other research has found. However, one of the challenges with interpreting this type of research is that these studies are often done using headless browsers or bots, which don't account for the personalized nature of the recommendation algorithm, disconnecting the recommendation algorithm from the data on which it relies to operate. Or this research has been done in the past using web browsing data, so looking at what videos people have watched previously. However, when we use that type of data, we can see what users were clicked on that they were recommended, but we can't actually see what options they had. So we can't disentangle the demand that users have for a particular type of content from the supply that YouTube is providing. So what we did in our study was we looked at a few different phenomena based on large concerns about the recommendation system, how they work, and what they might be driving users towards. We first looked at echo chambers, which we define as ideological content centered around the user's own ideology. So for a conservative, they're getting largely conservative content. We also look at rabbit holes, which we define as users getting recommendations that are increasingly extreme and increasingly narrow ideologically, and finally looking at ideological bias in the recommendations. So on average, what is the ideological leaning of recommendations that people are receiving? And the way that we did this was we conducted a survey. So we had a custom plugin created by one of our fantastic RAs, Charlotte G, where we recruited survey respondents on Facebook to install this extension. This extension during the course of the survey would collect what recommendations they saw. To remove the bias or potential demand effects, we had users start on a randomly assigned seed video. We selected the videos to cover the ideological spectrum and then randomize users into watching those different videos. And then we also randomized the traversal rule, meaning we controlled exactly what users clicked. We didn't let them pick what they wanted to watch. We said, you must pick this particular video. So things like always pick the first video or always pick the second video and so on. And then we finally did a short survey to ask them about how they use YouTube, what their demographics were. And what's particularly important for this piece of research, their party ID and ideology. But first, we were confronted with the issue that when we wanted to do this, we also had to estimate the ideology of a YouTube video, which is pretty challenging. This research led by Angela Lai outlines a method for estimating the ideology of YouTube videos at the video level. In the sort of big picture of this method is that we get subreddits and videos, and we use the network of videos that were posted in political subreddits to get an initial set of scores for videos posted in those subreddits, and then we train a BERT classifier on those videos and the scores that we got from Reddit, and I'll outline this in a little bit more detail in the following slides. So the first big step is we collect a bunch of political subreddits. So we identified 424 subreddits manually and then expanded that list using community detection. And from each of those subreddits, we pulled all of the times that a YouTube video was mentioned in that subreddit. So for ideological subreddits like r/conservative or r/neutral news, we got all of the videos that were posted in each of those subreddits. And then we created a correspondence matrix of the scores of videos within those subreddits and these subreddits that they were posted in. And we run correspondence analysis on this matrix similar to previous studies on Twitter and other platforms that have shown that you can use correspondence analysis to estimate ideology on this type of data. And we find that it works pretty well. Right-leaning videos like PragerU end up on the right. Left-leaning videos like Jordan Klepper end up on the left. We also can discuss later some of the validation we did on that. I'd be happy to chat about it in the Q&A. But we were confronted with this issue that the videos that appear on Reddit did not totally cover the videos that people may have encountered in the survey process. So to expand the list of videos that we could identify ideology for, we used the scores generated in the previous step of ideology for each of the videos, and then trained a text classifier based on the video metadata, so including things like the description, title, tags, and channel title to predict the ideology of any video that we have metadata for. So for this example video from Seth Meyers, we were able to classify it as liberal, even though it didn't appear on Reddit, because the text metadata of that video was similar to other liberal videos that we had identified from Reddit. So now, once we have these scores and we have all of the survey data from each of the users, we construct what we call traversals. So in this slide, I'm going to show an example traversal where on the x-axis, we're looking at the traversal step. So how many times they've clicked through the algorithm and clicked through recommendations in the survey task. And then on the y-axis, ideology. So this is an example video that people saw. We start on this generally left-leaning video. And then for each of the recommendations, we're able to score the ideology and show a distribution of the recommendations that people saw on that traversal step. And then we do that for each step in the traversal task. So for this given user, we could see that the ideology was generally diverse, pretty on average moderate. However, of concern, I think to a lot of us is that the recommendation paths like this, where we had a respondent in our survey who had an initially diverse set of recommendations and then pretty quickly ended up on very conservative and very ideologically narrow recommendations. So what I'm going to show here is the overall findings from our survey for all users. So on the x-axis, we're looking at the distribution of ideology, and on the y-axis, we're going to be looking at the different traversal steps that we've grouped from 0 to 5, 5 to 10, and so on. So this is sort of the initial step. We see there's quite a bit of overlap across all the users. Democrats are highlighted in blue, Republicans are highlighted in red, and moderates in the like white gray color. And so like this sort of doesn't seem super concerning to us. But then, you know, we get to steps 5 and 10, and then 10 to 15 and 15 through 20, and we see pretty similar findings. We don't see in terms of echo chambers, there's quite a significant overlap. In our statistical analysis of this, we did find a statistically significant difference between what liberals were recommended and what conservatives were recommended. However, as we can see in this graph, the magnitude of that difference is incredibly small. In terms of our rabbit hole discussion and what we're conceptualizing as a rabbit hole, we don't actually think there's huge cause for concern here. Overall, it doesn't look like en masse people are being sent off to very far extremes. But what we do see and what we think is sort of one of the findings that hasn't really been discussed in popular media is that there's a pretty significant rightward shift in recommendations that people received. So people started pretty close to 0. Which is moderate on our ideology scale, and all of the users, regardless of their ideology, on average, get increasingly conservative content recommended to them over the traversal task. And then in terms of this sort of motivating example, we did go and look at individuals in our data set and manually assessed the traversal paths of each of the users. So we had this graph for all of the people in our sample, and we did find that 14 out of around 500 survey respondents had traversal paths that looked like this. That's about 3%. So while we don't find that people are getting falling into rabbit holes at scale, or this is happening to like all users en masse, 3% of all YouTube users is a lot. That's several million Americans. So I think, you know, more research in this area on who the people are that are getting recommendations like this, what type of content they're getting, whether or not this type of pattern increases over time, I think will be really important in the future. So to sum up, our overall findings are that content recommended does vary to some extent by user ideology, but the magnitude of this difference is really, really small. There's limited evidence of users entering rabbit holes at scale, although, as I mentioned previously, there's definitely cause for concern with the small number of users that do fall into rabbit holes and what kind of content they're receiving and being recommended. And finally, we find that YouTube pushes all users, or on average, all users, regardless of their ideology, towards more center-right and increasingly narrow content. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Megan. And I want to thank both Megan and Parker for sticking within the designated time. And I want to remind our audience members that you can use the Q&A button on the bottom of the webinar screen to ask questions at any point in time now. And after David is done, we'll go to questions. So hopefully there'll be more from the audience there. So our final presenter today is David Thiel, who is the Big Data Architect and Chief Technology Officer of the Stanford Internet Observatory. Prior to Stanford, David worked at Facebook, primarily focusing on security and safety for Facebook connectivity, a collection of projects aimed at providing faster and less expensive internet connectivity to unconnected or underconnected communities. He will present research on the right-wing platforms of Parler, Getter, Gab, and Truth Social. David?
Thank you very much. I'm David Thiel. I work at the Stanford Internet Observatory. We are a kind of broad cross-disciplinary effort on analyzing and reducing various kinds of online harm. Today, I'll be talking a little bit about some of our work doing ingest analysis and kind of cross-site comparisons of some of the more right-wing alternatives that have emerged for sites, primarily to replace Twitter. So when we talk about things like alt platforms or far-right online forums, most of this tends to be something that tries to clone elements of Twitter, combine it with some various odds and ends from sites like Reddit, for example, upvoting and downvoting and things like that Twitter doesn't have. These are marketed as free speech oriented websites. They provide homes for users that have either kind of been ideologically displaced from these larger sites or have been actually displaced more specifically by being deplatformed from those sites overall. A lot of these sites operate on a fairly small scale, but the content that they produce does end up propagating back to the main social media sites and does potentially have an effect on discourse there. They're also very much focused on the news and memes aspect of kind of what would normally be the Twitter sphere. They're not things that are designed to be a full replacement for various types of online community. So when we actually ingest these and we try and release open source tooling for all of these projects, which I can link you to at the end of the presentation, essentially what we do is we try and do full site ingest of these various sites. We have a data enrichment layer that we've designed that gives us some additional information on, for example, toxicity scoring, safe search ratings of media, as well as perceptual hashes that allow us to track content between these sites. And for the most part, the research that we've released has been point-in-time analyses as these sites have grown. We aim for continuous ingest, but we also have to redesign tooling as APIs break, as anybody that's tried to build large data ingest has probably experienced. So comparing a few of these sites, the actual popularity is not necessarily what is intuitive from media that one might consume. Gab is actually, at least when we look at web visits, we don't have insight into app usage necessarily, but if we look at web visits, Gab, the earliest and launched and most toxic of these sites, actually gets the most activity, even with a relatively small user base. We've seen Parler, for example, drop down from being highly popular to being largely a ghost town. But that has also had some knock-on consequences itself, which we'll get into in a bit. And then we have Getter, which is kind of the bottom of the modern pack of these sites, and Truth Social, which is getting a moderate following, but is not seeing explosive growth so far. An update to this, Truth Social did just release an Android application, but I don't think the ratings are available or accurate at this point. So I'll give a brief overview of kind of the niches of these platforms and then talk about kind of some of the implications of them. Parler, as most people are familiar with it, was famously involved in the January 6th insurrection, in the planning and largely documenting of that insurrection, and was a source of media for identifying participants in it. It was taken offline as a result of AWS, Twilio, and a few other service providers in the aftermath of January 6th, deciding that they didn't want to provide services to that platform. It did eventually come back and did finally return to the App Store, but it has not really seen a return to function. So in this case, at least for this site specifically, that deplatforming did serve to apparently kill the growth curve of this site. The reason why it was allowed back into the app stores is because they did make significant changes to their content moderation, with the potential acquisition of the site that has been recently announced. That may run into some complications since the new purchaser is mostly a fan of anti-Semitic content, and that has been explicitly banned from Parler. If it were to reintroduce it, we would probably go through another cycle of being removed from app stores, and I don't think it would probably survive another round of that. Getter was launched a bit later and had a fairly rapid and splashy growth. It is now kind of flattened. This one was developed in large part by Miles Guo, who, if anybody is familiar with kind of studying Chinese diaspora disinfo, is a prominent distributor of conspiracy theories, largely based around opposing the regime in China, but also a very prolific source of COVID disinformation. It was generally better engineered than sites like Parler. It has had a bit of a better stability record, but it is still has relatively flat growth at this point, albeit in a much better situation than Parler. Truth Social, being the most recently launched, this one is very narrowly scoped around a US audience, while other sites we've seen, for example, far-right Brazilian networks find communities there. Truth Social is only available in the US. It is IP blocked to anyone outside of it. So it is very much just US MAGA-related content. It started with an invite-only process that had many stalls in the course of the site's development, but at this point has technologically stabilized. It does seem that the growth is a little bit hard to get insight into. They've been making changes to the site and the APIs to not allow people to actually see how many people have engaged with or liked content, or how many users follow a particular user, only showing the first 40 or so, which leads to some suspicion about how accurate those numbers actually are. We can't actually verify any of the actual engagement data on the site in its current form. And then finally, Gab, which is the most active of these sites. It's the most explicit in its ideology, in that it is very much in, both by its owners and users, promotes outright white supremacy and Christian nationalism. It also only does moderation of content which it deems personally offensive, which is fairly little, as well as things that are illegal under US law. One thing that is different from the other sites mentioned here is that it does have public and private groups. These tend to be fairly small, but they also tend to be amplification chambers for taking extremely far-right content, very racist and anti-Semitic content, as well as narratives about LGBT people, and taking those to migrate into more wide distribution meme groups and things like that. So it does act as a way to have new users introduced to extremist content in a more graduated fashion rather than kind of dumping them in directly to it. Gab does not have apps in the app stores for this reason. They have not shown any interest in changing their moderation practices, so it is currently web only. So as I mentioned, all of these sites do market as being free speech platforms to some degree. They, in some cases, moderate more than mainstream sites. They remove adult content. They remove people that they ideologically disagree with, or people that just annoy them. They also are all when they launch have been playing catch up when it comes to automated and manual content moderation. So we've seen more than one of these sites not have any systems in place for detecting violent or adult content. We've seen at least one that did not implement photo DNA, such that it was allowing uploads of child sexual abuse material. So these are companies that tend to get launched before they have much of an idea of what's necessary for online trust and safety. In terms of the things that have spilled out into the real world, Gab was most famously involved in the 2018 Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. It was a very active planning ground for the 2022 trucker convoys against anti-COVID measures. Parler, as we discussed with the coup, Getter is mostly avoided this. It's not the most radical of the platforms. And then most recently, Truth Social has been the primary source of organizing Dropbox watching activity around the US ahead of the midterms. So some findings just comparing some of these. One of the main things that we look at when we look at these sites is that they've all been either a response to or have dealt with some form of deplatforming. Either the users were deplatformed from other sites, the sites were deplatformed themselves via effectively a boycott of service providers. This probably is overall good for the platforms that may deplatform users from, say, Twitter or Facebook, but it has led to some unexpected effects. And what we've found there is that if you look here at the top graph where you see Parler's growth curve, we see really explosive growth at the end of 2020, peaking just ahead of the insurrection. And at the very end of this graph is when the site gets taken offline. That spike you see there is everybody furiously trying to archive content before it goes away. And if you drop down to what is the Gab growth curve, you'll see that just after that January 2021, when the site was actually shut down, we saw a huge spike in growth in user creation on Gab, which to one degree makes sense, but it's also a bit problematic because before this, Gab was actually in financial dire straits. And the Parler shutdown appears to be something of a primary cause for financially reinvigorating the site. They got a huge growth in Gab Pro subscribers, in donors, and it seems to have given them pretty strong financial footing, along with a growth curve that seems to be steadily increasing, unlike any of the other sites that we're dealing with. So I think, at least for me, comparing this and particularly seeing the growth move from site to site, it does raise some questions of, what is the desired effect of deplatforming users and sites? If we drive them to places where they're more easily exposed to radicalizing content like Gab, what are the trade-offs involved there? There are other directions that we can take potentially with containing users on those mainstream sites rather than pushing them entirely off-site. There are also potential directions that could be taken in terms of more aggressively deplatforming the extremist sites themselves, and either technologically or financially. So we have a number of reports that analyze kind of more of the nature of the content and the overall statistics of the user base on these various sites. We don't have time to go over all four, but you can check out all of these. We have 3 white papers, one on Parler, Getter, and Gab that will give more detailed breakdowns. Also, for people that are interested in doing research on these sites, we do have publicly available open source tools for Gab, Getter, and Truth Social. And we are happy for any contributions there, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, David. I'm going to I'll take the chair's prerogative and ask the first question myself. But again, our panelists have been helpfully answering a lot of the questions in the Q&A box, but if you have additional questions, please add them to the Q&A box. So David, to give you a moment to catch your breath here, I'll start with Parker and then with Megan and Parker. Parker, can you give us a sense of how popular explicitly political content is on TikTok? Obviously we're here because we're interested in politics. And can you give us a sense of how close we are to even being able to answer that particular question? And I think there's 2 ways of thinking about it. One way of thinking about it is relative to other content, like is TikTok a political platform, or is it a non-political platform that just has little political content? But then also more in terms of just sheer quantity of it, right? Like if Gen Z is now spending more time on TikTok than they are on Facebook or Instagram, is this a place where they are actually getting a lot of political content, even if it's a small fraction of the total content they're getting?
Sure. I think that, to your point, it's going to be hard to know what exact percentage of content on TikTok is innately political. But in my experience, I think that Gen Z users are viewing TikTok as perhaps the primary place for political discourse on social media for a lot of users. And particularly as TikTok has transitioned from very short videos to allowing, videos of a few minutes in length up to, they were experimenting with 10 minutes earlier this year. This can become like very engaged political discourse, that rivals some of the longer political content that's available in places like YouTube. So I think that there's a huge amount of political discourse happening for Gen Z users. And I think that it's a place that we should definitely continue to study going forward, particularly as places like Twitter are kind of up in the air right now.
Yeah, just a super quick follow-up on that. I actually did an interview right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine with a French company that was expanding into the US that is basically like the entire interview was to be released on TikTok or on Instagram. And it was filmed vertically as opposed to horizontally. Are you seeing, when you talk about the amount of political content, is that because there is this sort of general political news ecosystem along those lines that are developing, or is it just because individuals, when they're posting videos, are infusing them with political content?
I would say, so a lot of it is user generated, right? Just your amateur users, but we're starting to see, I mentioned John Fetterman, so there's political candidates starting to use it. A very popular TikTok account is also the Washington Post, has like 3 full-time TikTok employees who like specifically make explicitly TikTok content kind of going over the news. So I think it's a mix. I suspect that a lot of it is sort of this user-generated discourse, and as I think more organizations and political candidates become aware of the political power that TikTok has and the demographics that it can reach, I suspect we'll see more political content being created specifically for TikTok by like candidates and professional media organizations.
Great, thanks. Megan, Sasha Alte has asked in the Q&A, says that 3% of users were recommended more ideologically extreme content, but have you looked at how many were recommended less ideologically extreme content when they started on more ideologically extreme videos? And then the larger question is like, how do you think this would compare to self-selection? Do you think that is 3%, if the algorithm is sending 3% of people into more ideologically extreme content, do you think that more than 3% of the people who sort of start following news and were not, if they had not been put into our 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 requirements on how they follow the algorithm, how do you think this might, compare to user choice? Which is a little more complex question.
Yeah, so on the first question, we found that 3% of people fell into like what we would call rabbit holes. So picture the example we showed where you see like the first couple videos are first couple sets of recommendations are more ideologically diverse and like cover the ideological spectrum, and then sort of go off into increasingly ideologically narrow and ideologically extreme content. The other 97% of our respondents did not have traversal paths like this. So they did on some occasions lean more conservative or more liberal. Often that coincided with the ideology of the user, but by and large, the recommendations were generally diverse, generally hovered around ideologically moderate content. In terms of the second question for implications, I think one of the reasons we did the study this way is because the way we think about how people are recommended content, whether they're clicking on more ideologically extreme content or recommended more ideologically extreme content, both are really bad outcomes, but the actual cause of like why people are clicking on that type of content is really important so we can actually mitigate this type of behavior. You could sort of see a scenario where if people, which previous studies have found that in large part, when people are encountering ideologically extreme content or far-right content, in particular, it's often because they subscribe to the channels that are producing that content. The intervention to reduce that amount of content in someone's feed is to either moderate that channel or have them unsubscribe from it, not change the recommendation system to not give you content that you subscribe to. However, the converse, if we found that even when users are not directly following the content, they're just encountering this content by accident, then the sort of technical change is to actually change the recommendation algorithm so this type of content isn't being recommended. So I think that's sort of where the like user demand versus user supply question is really important, or versus recommendation supply question is really important, because the sort of mitigation of this type of harm is really dependent on how people are actually coming across that content en masse.
David, so you closed at the end in your discussion by talking about deplatforming, and you raised this really interesting question that I think we've all wrestled with at times when we've been involved in discussions around content moderation on the big mainstream platforms. Is it more concerning when you end up taking people who are sort of in view on these mainstream platforms and pushing them off into these corners of the internet where there's less monitoring going on, where it's less clear what's going on, but also where these kind of dynamics that you've described happening on these alt-right platforms are taking place? My question for you is, have you given thought about how we might measure balancing these harms? Like, how would we know if it was worse to deplatform accounts from mainstream platforms, knowing that they were going to end up in this alt-right ecosystem that we've seen, versus the counterfactual of not deplatforming them from the mainstream platforms, not having this alt-right ecosystem emerge, but having them on the platforms? Like, what are the metrics we should be using, for people who are asked to give advice in this regard? Like, what are the metrics we should be using to think through this trade-off?
That's an excellent question to which I only have the beginnings of answers. So it is something that is very difficult to holistically analyze across an entire social media ecosystem, particularly given that, there's more than just the sites that we discussed here. There's also Telegram groups of various degrees of privacy where these users may end up migrating, and that's an environment that has potentially even worse oversight than any of these. I do think there is some value to keeping users on larger sites with more robust content and abuse monitoring mechanisms. I personally, and it's not necessarily a very popular viewpoint, I personally tend to be somewhat in favor of things that people might consider shadow banning. containment measures within those sites themselves. Because what we have seen is people are getting gradually funneled to places that are harder and harder to have insight into, even with Telegram and WhatsApp. And now those companies have started cooperating with, for example, the Brazilian government cracking down on misinformation there. We're now seeing users all moving to Signal, which, and this is kind of the end of the road in terms of what we can really observe online. So, not to play too much in kind of the going dark types of narratives, but I think that giving a little bit more thought to keeping users on platform and containment measures rather than wholesale, elimination, it deserves some better thought. In terms of metrics that go across those sites, I think that's research that has yet to be developed.
Thanks, David. We have 2 minutes left. And for those of you who've stuck around to the end, we'll go with a methodological question here, which is coming in the chat from Matt DeVerna, which is for Parker. How do you think about working towards a representative sample on TikTok? Is it possible right now, or we're all just waiting for the API to be released to be able to think about how to do with representative sample? I mean, I personally have talked to people at TikTok and said, you know what we really need? We need like a 1% sample, like literally have been talking about that, and the Decahose example and these kinds of things with the TikTok folks. But up until that point, can we get anything like a representative sample, or is it possible with the scraping methods? And you've got 1 minute.
From what we have right now, I would say, no, it's not possible to have a truly representative sample. And I also wouldn't, I don't know, you apparently know the people at TikTok much better than I do, but I'm not holding my breath. I would love to get access to an API, but with the lack of updates, I feel like we have to just proceed as if we're not going to have it anytime soon. I think that the best way to do this now is using some of the functions on TikTok that use TikTok's search mechanism, and then from there kind of snowballing out. So in my case, choosing the hashtags that are interested, and then grabbing the most recent videos from users' pages. It's not going to be perfectly representative, but at least you're getting out of whatever algorithmic sorting it might put your particular account into, and B, getting content beyond whatever the first search term that you used is. I think that's the best that we have right now, and I eagerly await being able to do better.
All right, I got kicked off of Zoom while that was happening, so I will I will look forward to hearing from you more about the answer to that question. But let me just take this opportunity now to thank everybody, to thank all of our attendees who've stuck with us for the whole hour, for sharing another lunch hour with us. I want to thank everyone who's come over the course of this whole seminar series. I want to thank Eric again for setting up and running the seminar series. It's been fantastic. I've learned a ton. And I hope you'll all join me in thanking our panelists for joining us today. This has been an incredibly interesting and illuminating conversation. It's given me a ton to think about. And thanks to Megan, thanks to Parker, thanks to Dave for joining us. David for joining us so much here today. So we'll see all of you. Good luck next week. As Parker said, remember to vote. And if you're in the US, and thanks so much for joining us. And we'll be in touch with future CSMAP programming as we develop it going forward. So thanks all. Take care.